Let us now publicly analyze what has been done there. Horror, dead rats, mice, condoms and other. Drugs. I warned you, you have to work there as in wartime. This week. To submit a proposal to replace the entire leadership of the vermin. Not a damn thing. The entire top from the reserve of personnel that I have formed. Who had the right to reverse my decisions? You have already bothered me with your idleness. Hello, you are on the Revolution of Consciousness channel. Today I want to discuss with you the state structure and the future of the presidential monarchy of Belarus. I call this country Belarus. GULAG, which in its decoding means the headquarters of Alexander Grigoryevich Lukashenko. And I did not choose the name Gulag by chance, since the ideology and form of vermin are very similar to the Stalinist dictatorship, but nevertheless it has some differences. In terms of its state structure and psychotype, Belarus is more reminiscent of a classical African state, with a ruler that has not been replaced for life. As a rule, such a ruler is completely obsessed with power and luxury, sexually dissatisfied, prone to pathological lies and endless thinking about his inheritance and successor. Alexander Grigoryevich will sit the Congress until the last moment. And you know this well-known joke, until Lukashenko is in power in Belarus? Until then, that is, too. His son. Fear is his main political tool for retaining power and in general, lust. Debauchery, violence and the desire to be the main judge, arbiter of destinies are the main psychological drugs that make this schizoid to the most imaginable and unthinkable crimes. Over time, such people, due to a long stay in power, gradually crazy, they develop a persecution mania, a conspiracy of their own greatness. Who had the right to reverse my decisions? During their life, being in power, they endow themselves not only with judicial but also with divine powers. For days on end, he poses as either a living prophet and a OD father or an elder brother of a mentor, but in fact as a banal fucker, a cruel merciless terrorist rapist, total control, a terrible repressive apparatus and an impoverished population are the main signs of a state suffering from a dictatorship. Everything is buoy on lies, the substitution of concepts and the search for the eternal enemy. Persecution mania and terrible fear is a real drug withdrawal, which turns a sick schizoid paranoid inside out. Everywhere they see caricatures, conspiracies, murderers, traitors and spies. Exacerbations usually begin with nervous attacks and terrible hysteria. When the withdrawal becomes unbearable, the addict takes a new dose in the form of layoffs, harassment, imprisonment and murder. It becomes easier for him, but not for long. Each time the dose only becomes more frequent and increases, as a residue of which it becomes much more dangerous not only for society, but also for the patient himself. I will give an order to the judicial system, to the investigative committee, to be punished in the most severe way. We put 200 or 300 people in prison, they will understand. Overdoses often occur and the domineering addict does not die by his own death. What is noteworthy, in recent years, cases with premature deaths have increased markedly. Less and less patients began to live up to their natural biological end. Exiles of darkness, from Ceausescu to Gaddafi. Horror, dead rats, mice, condoms and other drugs. Today we will discuss the fate of Belarus, which is very important and exciting for me. As an ethnic Belarusian, I wish all prosperity and well-being to this beautiful and kind country. I dream of the day when Belarus will recover, get rid of the dictatorial regime and become a normal, prosperous European state, and I have no doubt that this will happen anytime soon. Greetings to the channel Revolution of Consciousness, Bychkovsky at the microphone, S. It is obvious to any adequate person who is interested in history and political science that Lukashenko is a classic dictator and paranoid. This is evident not only from his false and hypocritical statements, but also from his actions. Just recently, a couple of days journalist Vladimir Chudentsov was arrested. Drugs were allegedly found on him. Obviously, this is a setup, exactly the same as we had in Russia with Galanov. The only difference is that the direct head of the state acted as the customer of this crime. This crime is very much reminiscent of our story with the Chechen human rights activist Oyub Titiev. Belarus is a very small state, 14 times smaller than Kazakhstan and slightly larger than Kyrgyzstan. The total area is only 207,595 square kilometers with a population of less than 10 million people, which is now comparable to the average metropolis. As a rule, in such small agglomerations, the head of the country is directly concerned with all areas of society. Consequently, the crimes against Chudintsov are a direct order of Lukashenko. And the recent parliamentary elections and the further desire of the mustachioed collective farmer to participate in the presidential elections proved to us that Lukash is not aimed to voluntarily part with the vermin and his entire state system consists entirely of moral monsters and bastards. I first came to Belarus in the 90s. Boris Abramovich Berezovsky organized a trip for Russian journalists and we were received by a gentleman. He is not my friend, President Lukashenko. It means that when I arrived, I was speaking on television. And television people came up to me and whispered some things in my ear. I say, why are you whispering? They say, so we can't speak out loud. You understand what it is here? I fay pretty quickly. I just fay. I returned to the Soviet Union. I just returned to the real Soviet Union. And then there was dinner and Boris Abramovich asked each of us to get up and say something. I tee up and said the following: Alexander Grigoryevich, you know. My mother taught me that if you break someone's bread, then you have to tell him either something od. Or nothing. I will not tell you anything, and sat down. This is how our relationship began. He knows me well. He doesn't love me much. He said several times that I received bribes for saying bad things about him. I personally deeply regret what is happening in your country. It is possible that the majority of the population still supports him. I am not an expert here, but I remember that the majority of the population of the Soviet Union supported and adored perhaps the bloodiest dictator in history, namely Stalin. Major officials, propagandists, cops and KGB officers, judges, the head of the CEC, members of election commissions, in short, all those who defend this regime, or rather its embodiment, are subject to criminal punishment and necessarily lustration. I am sure that we will very soon become witnesses of these revolutionary and judicial processes. Why? I'll explain to you a little later, be patient. And now I would like to discuss with you the term lustration in more detail. Reference: lustration, purification through sacrifice. Legislative restrictions introduced after the change of vermin to limit the rights of supporters of the previous vermin. Being not a new phenomenon, lustration took on the most decisive forms at the end of the 20th century in the post-communist states of Eastern and Central Europe, in the form of admission to civil service, vermin apparatus, law enforcement agencies, to other important posts and institutions of the education system of persons who were associated with the former communist regime, including the functionaries of the communist parties, employees and agents of the state security organs. It is assumed that the implementation of lustration should give legitimacy to the new vermin by a decisive break with the practice of the old vermin, which is perceived as criminal and illegal. In my opinion, the path of Czechoslovakia will be the most acceptable in the Belarusian version. I am deeply convinced that our main aims should be the revolution and lustration in the Republic of Belarus. Without this, there can be no question of any prosperity and well-being. Now let's discuss under what conditions these processes should begin. Of course, to launch these processes, a revolution of consciousness is needed in the active part of society. A revolution is a qualitative, radical, deep leap in any kind of human activity. Not a single modern developed society and state has yet done without revolutionary processes. Of course, Belarus is also on the verge of a great social revolution, and this is indicated by a number of signs. The first sign is a revolutionary situation according to Lenin. In short, the upper classes are fucked up, but the lower classes are fucked up, which makes ordinary members of society more actively participate in the country's social processes. The second sign is a simultaneously awning and more progressive crisis. It is economic, social and political. Having these two signs of revolutionary processes, we need to have only 5% of the active and very angry population concentrated in one point of the country. As a rule, we are talking about the capital of the state. In our case, it is necessary to bring about 500,000 people to the streets of Minsk. I understand that at this Moment in time it sounds fantastic and not very realistic, but if we consider that the people of Belarus have already massively attended rallies, then we can assume that it will come out again, only in a more expanded composition and with more harsh actions. You will say that this is unlikely, I would argue. First, the volume of oppositional and very high-quality information has grown significantly. Belarusian bloggers become not only leaders of public opinion, but also vivid fighters against the current regime. It is very important that these are, as a rule, young and educated people who sincerely want to change the life situation in their beloved country. They not only expand the area of their influence, but also actively consolidate society at one point. Agree, collecting several million views on YouTube in such a small country like Belarus is no longer a joke. Until recently, the Belarusian special services had an unwritten rule, not to stage provocations with weapons and drugs against the opposition. However, not so long these principles began to crumble. In 2017, on the eve of mass protests, there was a case against the White Legion of an illegal armed group, a jeep breaking through the border and preparing for mass riots. Serious articles. However, 6 months later, the case completely collapsed. Secondly, the state has lost its monopoly on information and is no longer capable of such high quality and active littering of brains. The quality of state propaganda has dropped markedly and its influence has diminished. Lukashenko's popularity, according to reliable and independent opinion polls, no longer exceeds 6 to 7%, and tends to zero among the young and middle population. No damn thing. Third, and the most pleasant thing, we must take into account that Lukashenko has very big problems at this point in time. A very dangerous and insidious enemy has become active in him. This is our Vladimir Vladimirovich Putin. Lukashenko hates Putin because he wants to take his charm away from him. The loss of charm for Lukashenko is the loss of the meaning of his life, and no matter how the mustachioed resisted, we will soon witness how Putin will very soon ruin his bald skull, hitting him in the head with an economic sledgehammer. What do you think about Lukashenko? Like Putin, two of a kind. They are generally twin brothers. The sooner our peoples get rid of these gentlemen, the better it will be for the Belarusian people and for the Russian. And the Belarusians realize it? No, many people there think that Putin is better, and that Lukashenko is better for us. So I can say, it is OD everywhere where we are not. Why do they hate each other? Because they are very similar. They have such an interspecific struggle. So there should be one male in the pride? Yes, then this. Cat-dog union, of course, is a classic. If you've read the history of World War II, Mussolini didn't really like Hitler, it was mutual. So dictators have a tradition of hating each other. This is what we actually see here in this specific historical context. Lukashenko's head rests on an anvil and is on a short leash with Putin. Lukash grins very viciously. But the whole trick is that his mouth is absolutely toothless and it is only capable of barking. You have already teased me with your idleness. Lukashenko is completely dependent on Putin. Since this Olafrenik has completely fucked up all the economic potential that he inherited from the Soviet Union. Let me remind you that the Republic of Belarus was a showcase of the USSR. Lukashenko took the country with the most developed, high-tech industry. Only Ukraine was cooler. But if we take the industrial potential per capita, then Belarus was number 1 in the entire post-Soviet space. What's post-Soviet? Belarus was more technologically advanced. Even among the countries of the former Socialist Sea, including Poland and Czechoslovakia. If we talk about numbers, for Excel, about external debt, at that time it was only 0.1% of the country's GDP, now it is already 27%. If we talk about income per capita, then under Lukashenko they certainly increased, but this growth has long been leveled out and does not correspond to modern realities. At the moment, in terms of per capita income, Belarus is lagging behind among European countries, and the situation will only get worse. Because the country is already tired of living and working for food and cheap clothes, and no one is clearly investing money in the country headed by the dumbass wants. As a resu, the country is completely stagnant and completely degraded. Young people are fleeing abroad en masse, and there is a shortage of personnel in the country. The total shortage of specialists leads not only to the decline of industry, but also to the degradation of the agricultural producer. All over the country, cows are dying, labor productivity is falling, and the vaunted Lukashenko's image of the country's chief agronomist and bulbish has long since lost its credibility, causing everyone only ridicule. I look at what is happening in Belarus. With great sadness, with great concern. The president who has managed to bring the country to the edge of poverty, who is held today by some incomprehensible constant trade with Russia and, in my opinion, on nothing more. And who crushes all dissenting people in the bud and at the same time speaks of some kind of democracy. This, of course, cannot last long. If Putin is young or a sledgehammer, then the European Union acts as an anvil. And the point here is not so much in European sanctions as in Lukashenko's ability to influence Russia by currying favor with Western partners. Remember how Lukash was crucified in front of Merkel, how he grimaced and tried to appear OD during the signing of the Minsk agreements. Believe me, if it were not for this circumstance, the mustachioed would have long sent the fuck out to the European Union and would have staged a classic Stalinist terror in the country, forcing everyone to work in their factories for a bowl of gruel. But times have changed. Belarus, like all European powers, has long and very deeply been integrated into the world economy, and therefore it will not be possible to isolate itself from the rest of humanity, as North Korea did. And the Belarusian public, mostly young people infected with European values, clearly does not want to drain their country to Lukash, alone give it up to be torn apart by Putin's Russia. All of the above arguments allow me to conclude that the political situation around Lukash is extremely unfavorable. The mustache is cornered and resembles a mad dog that is about to break the skull. I personally do not see a single positive scenario for the current regime. The transfer of power is unlikely, because Lukash is still a fairly young and physically healthy fellow, therefore there is no need to talk about a voluntary transfer of power to a successor or heir. But we can speculate about the revolution, because this is the only possible scenario for the near future. In chess there is such a term zugzwang, translated from German compulsion to move. This is a situation in checkers and chess, in which any player's move leads to a deterioration in his position. This applies not only to Lukashenko, but also to Putin. Our fabulous president sees only the absorption of Belarus as the only way out for himself and the solution to all his Napoleonic ambitions, but he is unlikely to succeed. For this is an impossible task, not only physically and economically, but most importantly morally and ideologically. Everyone is tired of Crimea and Syria, and Putin himself has long exhausted his political potential and is on the verge of death himself. His strength will only be enough to drag Lukashenko to his grave. How I may be wrong, it is even possible that Lukash himself will drag the GDP away with him much faster. If we talk about the terrible and omnipotent repressive apparatus of the mustachioed paranoid, then he has long been standing on feet of clay. Ego slabos ne tolko v otsisvi ideology. No I v slabum financerovani. Povert mani, kogda naknutsa sereznie sticky na ulika minska. Belaruski menti proavit siba ne samum luxum obrazum. Ibo padihat I otdavat svu skuru za. Roskosnu zizan usadago tovaris amalo k2 zahoset. Idogam visego adago destvias stanet polnai collapse. Lakasankoskogo gasudarstva. Strani zapata, kak a2 uz bivalo ne raz, ne upistat svogo sanza. Lisnij raz Nazareth Patinu v Carmen. Primeram nam mogat posluzit revolutiony procesi v. Pribalti, Gruzi, Ukraine, Armenia Moldova I tak dali. Belarus a2 malenkoi gasudarstvo. Asledovatelno I integratia v Evropeski subshistva, kak pokazivat praktika. Takinabul si stran prohodit namnago legche I bystri jem uzitaroveni. Primeram mozit. Posluzit Ukraina, Kotoru sa du si por asanai asan silno treset, nesmotra na desidio tam. Uz arvanulo kak 6 let nazit. Eslizi goverit o Putin, tan uz nevi sostani sidio libo. Protivopostavit, slozhasej sa tendency po vesma banalnoj pricine, on star I izmotin. Ego aptarite podorvan, a ekonomijski potential ego urodlovoj rosijskij fiadalnoj ekonomiki uz. Polnostu isrpan, istoria razvivatsa po svojim zakonam I vis ukazivat nata, cdo Belarus stoit. Na poroj bolsi I fundamentalnai politiski izmenenij pod. Nazvanium revolutia saznania, du novi vistrek, s vami bil istorik Bykovsky, Poka, Druza.
До новых встреч. С вами был историк Бычковский. Пока, друзья.